Good evening and welcome. Can everybody hear me? I'm Peter Mears, Associate Curator of the Ransom Center's art collection. On your way into the theater tonight, I'm sure each of you noticed Frida Kahlo's painting, Self-Portrait with Thorn Necklace and Hummingbird, just outside in the hallway niche. Painted in 1940, this famous and frequently borrowed artwork has finally come home to roost. Well, at least until January 3rd of next year, when it will travel again, this time to Europe, appearing in a major retrospective exhibition in Berlin and Vienna. Over the last 2 decades, Frida Kahlo's self-portrait has been on almost continuous loan, featured in more than 25 museums in the United States and around the world. And we are certainly pleased to have her back for now. Sharing our cultural treasures with sister institutions is an important part of our mission. By providing broader access to our collections this way, we offer the greater public the opportunity to personally experience a public icon, and for scholars, curators, and students alike, new opportunities to study and reevaluate further an important artist's contributions to the artistic canon. Indeed, the exhibition-loan history of Kahlo's self-portrait traces the trajectory of her rise to iconic status. For example, if we look back over the years to 1978, we find Kahlo's self-portrait with Thorn Necklace and Hummingbird appearing in her first solo exhibition in the United States. That exhibition traveled across the country from Chicago to San Diego, Phoenix, and New York, making a stop along the way here in Austin, across campus at what was then called the University Art Gallery. Interestingly, the exhibition's catalog contained an essay by Hayden Herrera, tonight's guest speaker for the Ransom Center's 2009 Amon Carter Lecture series. Ms. Herrera's research for that show also brought her to Austin. So in a sense, the artist and her biographer have come full circle back to Texas, a fitting way to honor the painting's homecoming and a wonderful way to welcome Hayden Herrera back to Austin. Hayden Herrera is a New York-based art historian, critic, and independent curator whose first book, Frida, a biography of Frida Kahlo, was published in 1983. In 2002, that biography became the basis for a major motion picture. Her second full biography, Arashil Gorky, His Life and Work, published by Ferrara, Strauss, and Giraud in 2003, was a finalist for a Pulitzer Prize. Herrera has also written on the sculptor Mary Frank, the French modernist master Henri Matisse, and painter Joan Snyder. She has curated a number of exhibitions. More recently, she served as co-curator for Frida Kahlo, the centennial exhibition that opened at the Walker Art Center in 2007 and traveled to the Philadelphia Museum of Art and the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. Herrera has published articles and reviews in Art in America, Art Forum, Art News, Harper's Bazaar, and the New York Times, amongst others. Currently, she's working on a biography of the sculptor Isamu Noguchi. After her talk, we'll open the floor to Q&A, so please join in. And now, please join me in welcoming Hayden Herrera.
Well, I'm very happy to be back in Austin. It was many, many decades ago. To be talking about Frida Kahlo, whose place in the world has become so much stronger since I was here, whatever it was, 30 years ago. I'm going to start right away with a slide, The Broken Column from 1944. Beginning in 1926, when Frida Kahlo painted her first self-portrait at the age of 19, and ending with her death at the age of 47 in 1954, the Mexican painter Frida Kahlo produced some 66 self-portraits, plus about 80 paintings of other subjects, mostly still lives and portraits of friends. She painted herself so often in order to make herself known, and also to extend her being into the world. And she certainly succeeded. In the last 25 years, Frida Kahlo has become an international cult figure. Starting in the late 70s, thanks to feminism, multiculturalism, and probably the Hispanic, the Mexican-American movement that had a passion for Frida, the Chicanos, numerous books, films, and exhibitions focusing on Kahlo began to appear. What is called Frida Mania prompted an industry. Restaurants were named after Frida. Her exotic native costumes inspired the fashion world. And Frida Kahlo t-shirts, jewelry, refrigerator magnets, calendars, and even computer mouse pads, I wish I had one, turned up in shops everywhere. A few years ago, there was an uproar in the United States when we had a stamp with Frida Kahlo on it, and the uproar was caused because, after all, she wasn't American and she was a communist. Kahlo has captured the imagination of scholars, artists, and movie stars. Madonna, you may remember, many years ago, wanted to make a movie in which she would play Frida, and I had an interview with her, and she said, "Frida was a drama queen, and I can identify with that." Salma Hayek, who starred in Miramax's wonderful, I think it's really quite good, the Kahlo film, was equally passionate in her identification with Frida. As a cult figure, Kahlo has taken on a kind of magical power. Her self-portraits have become objects to be revered like icons. More important, Kahlo's work has been inspirational for artists, especially for women artists, but also for a whole generation of Mexican artists in the 1980s who followed Kahlo's example in making art that is emphatically personal. So as you can see here in the broken column, she painted herself cracked open after a surgery. She had many surgeries. Wearing Christ's crown of thorns, and this is the wonderful painting that is in the Harry Ransom Center, one of Frida's greatest self-portraits. This is from 1940. Hemorrhaging during a miscarriage. This is from 1932. Anesthetized on a hospital trolley. This one is from 1946. It's called Tree of Hope. Sleeping with a skeleton, it's called The Dream, it's from 1940. And always, even when she is accompanied by her husband, the famous muralist Diego Rivera, who appears here in her forehead, Kahlo, I think, looks fearfully alone. Her self-portraits are extraordinary for the honesty with which she faced the changes in herself through suffering and through age. In her direct and self-debunking manner, Kahlo explained, quote, "I paint my own reality, and the only thing I know is that I paint because I need to, and I paint whatever passes through my head without any other consideration." Kahlo pierced so deeply into the personal that her message became universal. And as a result, when we look at her self-portraits, each of us feels that Kahlo is speaking directly to us. Kahlo's small, meticulously painted self-portraits demand our attention by singling out the viewer as the person who must share Kahlo's feelings. Yet the portraits are often shockingly self-revealing. They do not, though they are shockingly self-revealing, they do not offer a full confession. Gripped by the magnetism of these paintings, we come to realize that Kahlo really never lets down her mask of reserve. This withholding accounts in part for the strange energy that radiates from her self-portraits. It was this energy that prompted the surrealist, essayist, and poet André Breton to call Kahlo's work, quote, "a ribbon around a bomb." The energy comes also from Kahlo's intense need to confront and to communicate her pain. It was as if, by putting the pain out onto an icon away from her body, she could free herself from it. I wanted to tell you, the one on the left is Fulang Chang and I, and the one on the right is Self-Portrait with Small Monkey, 1945. The one on the left is from 1937, when Frida was really at the height of her beauty. Kahlo explained about her work, "I paint self-portraits because I am so often alone, because I am the person I know best." She had time to know herself. In 1925, when she was 18, a trolley plowed into the bus that she was riding home from school. It almost killed her, and it left her a partial invalid for life. And it was while recuperating that she began to paint. This is her first self-portrait from about a year after the accident, maybe a little less than a year. It's from 1926. Her first self-portrait reveals that from the beginning, painting the image that she saw in the mirror was both a self-exploration and a way of attaching people to her, of holding their love. The painting was, in fact, a gift for her boyfriend at the time. His name was Alejandro Gomez Arias. She sent it to him, but it was at a moment when he was actually pulling away from her. I think after the accident, I think he realized that continuing his relationship with Frida would be just too difficult. And he eventually went off to Europe, partly to get away from Frida, I think. But anyway, she sent it to him, and she wrote him this note saying, quote, "I implore you to hang it in a low place where you can see it as if you were looking at me." So you could see that the paintings were almost like substitutes for Frida. Feeling isolated by illness, Kahlo painted these extra Fridas, these extra substitute Fridas, that could withstand life's blows and confirm her fragile hold on life. This dialogue with herself produced some of the most original and courageous imagery of the 20th century. In 1932, the Riveras, Frida and Diego, were in Detroit, and Kahlo suffered a terrible miscarriage there. And to alleviate her depression, Rivera suggested that she paint works on tin, like Mexican ex-voto or retablo painters, and also that she paint her own life. So she started this project, really almost at the beginning, by painting her own birth, which is from 1932, and it basically must have to do both with her own birth, but also it's expressing her grief over losing the child in Detroit. Kahlo was born in 1907 in Coyoacan, which was then a southern suburb of Mexico City. Her father was a German-born photographer who came to Mexico in the end of the 19th century. Her mother was a Mexican of mixed Indian and Spanish descent. Kahlo said about my birth that it showed how I imagined I was born, but it is a peculiar nativity in that everybody in it is dead. She explained why the mother had her head covered. She said, my head. So it is, even though it's her birth, she's saying that it's my head. So she is the mother as well. My head is covered because coincidentally with the painting of my birth, my mother died. So the dead mother is both Frida Kahlo and her mother, and the baby is both Frida being born, but also the child that she lost to miscarriage in Detroit. After the 1932 miscarriage, Kahlo began to make paintings that resemble retablos, which are Mexican ex-votos. You see one on the right here. These are votive paintings on tin, almost always with an inscription below. They're usually on tin, and then they have the holy figure, either a saint or the Virgin or Christ, floating up above, and an image of the terrible thing that's happening to the subject down below. And they're placed in a church in order to give thanks for salvation from some terrible illness or disease. In my birth, the Virgin of Sorrows that you see above the bed, the painting above the bed, which is stabbed by knives, she takes the place of the holy image in a retablo. And like a retablo, there is a scroll, and it's also it's painted on a small sheet of tin. But the scroll is not filled in because, after all, there was no salvation. It's really a painting of a double death. Here, as in many of her paintings, the retablo-like small scale, many Frida Kahlo's paintings are mostly quite small, and the kind of primitivism of style helps to distance what is often pretty horrific subject matter. If you could imagine My Birth being a huge, very realistic painting, it would be very hard to look at. Kahlo went on with the story of her life in My Nurse and I, and these are not really chronological. This is from 1937, so it's 5 years later, which is one of her favorite of her own paintings. It shows her in the arms of her Indian wet nurse, and here she is declaring her pride in her native roots, but at the same time, it's really about Frida Kahlo's feeling of separation. Loneliness is a theme that is prevalent in almost all of her works. And I think you can feel that in the nurse's unloving embrace. Again, it's like a retablo. It's a small painting on tin, and the scroll down below is not filled in. Kahlo said about this painting that she gave herself an adult head because it was the adult that did the remembering, the adult Frida, and then she gave her nurse the Teotihuacan mask because she didn't really remember her nurse's face. She said about this painting, quote, "I came out looking like such a little girl, and she, the nurse, so strong and saturated with providence that it made me long to sleep." So it sounds as though for her it was a comforting painting. And yet I feel that the nurse embodies a kind of cruel fatalism, that she's not protective. What I think Frida Kahlo has done here is taken the traditional Madonna Caritas image of the Madonna suckling Christ and changed it to express her own feelings of loss and disconnection. That feeling of separation started early. Kahlo said, "My mother couldn't suckle me because 11 months after I was born, my sister Christina was born. I was fed by a nana whose breasts they washed every time I was going to suckle." Actually, this nurse turned out to be an alcoholic, and her mother fired the nurse. The next in this series, in fact, this is from 1936, so it's a year earlier, but it shows Frida probably at about 2 years old. She's in the patio of the Blue House in Coyoacan, where she was born and died, and which is now the Frida Kahlo Museum. Many of you probably visited it in Coyoacan, Mexico City. It's really a family tree seen from a child's point of view. The child very central, her parents taken from a wedding photograph that's actually in the Frida Kahlo Museum are huge. But it's also a triple self-portrait in that you see Frida as a fetus on her mother's pristine wedding dress, and then down below you see Frida's conception. And it's I'm just going to show you a picture of the Blue House in Coyoacan to show you how closely connected Frida Kahlo's art is with her life. She really drew from her own immediate experience all the time. So that's the patio of the Blue House where the child Frida is situated in that painting. Kahlo's father, Guillermo Kahlo, you see a portrait that she did of him in 1951. And then on the right is a self-portrait. He was a photographer, and that is a self-portrait that he did. Probably about the same time. I think it's probably about 1950, around that time. Frida Kahlo identified much more with her father than with her mother, who was very Catholic and very conservative and rather annoyed with Kahlo. Even though she loved her mother, she was often annoyed with her. Her father was a strange, intellectual, slightly taciturn man. He liked to read philosophy, and he loved to teach Frida about science and loved to take her on outings. He also taught Frida Kahlo, he taught her photography, and he made her into one of his assistants. And her first experience with brushes were the little tiny retouching brushes that were used for his photographs. So that may have some reason why about the jewel-like miniaturism of many of her paintings. And of course, her father did a number of self-portraits, and self-portraits became something that Frida Kahlo did a lot of, as you know. And I think there's something about his photographs, his portrait photographs, that did influence her conception of the portrait, not only of herself, but of other portraits of other people. Kahlo, about the age of 7, came down with polio, and her father was the one that really helped to cure her and get her back to health. She was isolated for quite a long time in her room. And then when she was finally well enough, she had her right leg was extremely withered. So she'd wear many pairs of socks in order to hide this withered leg. But when she'd go out into Coyoacán, other children would tease her, calling her Frida Kahlo, pata de palo, which means Frida Kahlo, peg leg. So at 7, there was already first the long isolation, and then this sense of being different. Because of her withered leg. But the illness was also a tremendous bond with her father, who was an epileptic. And Kahlo would have to go out with him on his photography outing to make sure that people, if he had an epileptic seizure, that his camera would not get stolen. Kahlo said of her father, she said, "My childhood was marvelous because although my father was a sick man, he had vertigos every month and a half. He was an immense example to me of tenderness, of work, photographer and also painter, and above all, of understanding for all my problems." In the painting on the left, Four Inhabitants of Mexico, which was done in 1938, Kahlo seems to be about 4 years old. Here she's moved out from the protection of her patio and into the open plaza of Coyoacán. The inhabitants of Mexico that accompany her are actually objects that she and Diego Rivera owned. They're popular art objects. Well, there's a pre-Columbian idol, and then the figure on the left that's wired with fireworks is a Judas figure that they're blown up on the Saturday before Easter. Then a skeleton, but it's a big version of those little clay skeletons that children get on the Day of the Dead, and then a little burro out of straw behind. The painting, they're very often skeletons in Frida Kahlo's work. She shared with Mexicans a preoccupation with death. In this painting, I think that the square's huge emptiness, it's almost like a Chirico, gives a sense of Frida Kahlo's estrangement, very much like the sense in Henry Ford Hospital where she's on that bed and there's this vast open space behind her. In most of her self-portrait, on the right is Girl with Death Mask, also from 1938. I think it's probably a self-portrait, almost certainly. The flower, a little yellow flower, is the flower that's associated with death in Mexico. And my feeling about this painting is that it's always had to do with Frida Kahlo's memory of having polio as a child. In most self-portraits, Frida Kahlo is immobilized, cut off from her surroundings, and alone. She is disconnected from everyone except the object of her gaze, which is both us, the viewer, and Kahlo herself, since looking in the mirror and at her self-portraits in progress really made Kahlo her own chief spectator. In 1922, Frida Kahlo entered the National Preparatory School in the middle of Mexico City. It's now a wonderful museum. This is a photograph of her at probably about that age when she started at the Preparatoria. And here is Diego Rivera, who made his first mural in 1922 in the school's amphitheater. That school was a center of political ferment during the post-revolutionary years, and it was really in this school where the Mexican mural renaissance began. Orozco was also painting murals here. Kahlo took note of Diego Rivera, and she apparently developed a huge crush on him, but she also made him the butt of her mischief. Apparently she soaped these stairs that he had to climb in order to paint his mural, but he, having this sort of elephantine grace, did not fall. He lumbered very slowly and carefully up and down those stairs. Kahlo told her school friends, my ambition in life is to have a child by Diego Rivera, and I'm going to tell him so someday. But then came, in 1925, the terrible accident. And her spine was broken in 3 places, her right leg was broken, and a metal handrail pierced her pelvis. This is a retablo that Frida Kahlo probably found. There are a lot of retablos in Mexico of bus accidents, but that she then changed and made it her own bus accident, and added an inscription saying from her parents, saying the parents of Frida are so glad that she was saved from this terrible accident. Kahlo was not expected to live. She was taken to the Red Cross hospital, and when she did slowly recover, she wrote to Alejandro, her boyfriend. She said, "In this hospital, death dances around my bed at night." And she certainly, for the rest of her life, was very much aware of death dancing around her bed. For her, life was a battle against slow disintegration. She had something like 30 surgical operations, but the accident was what made her an artist. She had planned to become a doctor before that. And she was, as she put it, bored as hell in bed, and she needed a way to help support her family, so that working at painting was something she could do at home without moving too much. This is, again, her first self-portrait from 1926, and on the right, one from 2 years later of her sister Christina. It's from 1928, her younger sister that was born 11 months after Frida. Her first works were mainly portraits of family and of herself and of friends. If you look at these two that are 2 years apart, I think it's sort of the difference between night and day. By 1928, when she painted her sister, she had pretty much recuperated. And it was at that time that she took her first paintings to show to Diego Rivera, who was at work at the Ministry, big mural sequence, wonderful mural sequence at the Ministry of Education in Mexico City. She showed them to Rivera. He admired the paintings. He also admired the painter. A courtship began, and then they married in 1929. When Kahlo came into contact with Rivera, her art changed. And I think if you compare these two with this, her second self-portrait from after she knew Rivera, it's from 1929. What you have here is a contemporary Mexican girl in cheap kind of, she's wearing a blouse, the kind you could buy in the market, a pre-Columbian necklace and colonial earrings to show, I guess, that she's a mestiza. And what's happened here, this is not yet wearing her Tehuana costume, but it was when she came in, just became Rivera's wife, and that she started wearing Tehuana costumes. The Tehuana costume was the costume of the women of Tehuantepec, who are legendary for their strength. They run the markets and they run the money. She chose to wear Mexican regional costumes partly to hide her limp, and also to camouflage her pain, but also to show her allegiance to the Mexican people, and finally also to please Diego Rivera, who felt that Mexican women should wear Mexican clothes, not kowtow to European bourgeoisie. After she met Rivera, Frida Kahlo, like many Mexican painters of this post-revolutionary period, began to paint Indians. And this is her painting on the left, and a painting, that one is, again, is from 1929 when she married Rivera. And the one on the right is by Rivera. It's from 1926, Girl with Coral Necklace. I think that the Kahlo, I mean, Rivera made many, many of these portraits of cute Mexican children, very stereotypical. They're good, but they're somewhat, I think he painted them for the tourist trade. Whereas Kahlo's painting of this little girl, she's a very individual little girl, And with that little safety pin, very poignant safety pin holding her dress together, I think you feel that there was a definite rapport between the painter and the sitter in this case. They married in August of 1929. On the left is their wedding photograph. Kahlo is smoking. She often is smoking in photographs and in her self-portraits. And 2 years after they were married, Kahlo painted this marriage portrait in 1931. She was in San Francisco, she painted it. When they married, Frida's mother, who was horrified, said it was like the marriage between an elephant and a dove. And Kahlo adored Rivera, so she didn't mind his looking like, she called him his big frog, her frog toad. She chronicled their marriage in paint, and this is probably one of the more sanguine images having to do with their marriage. But there are already some problems. Rivera started being unfaithful to Frida right away. I mean, he was never faithful to her. The problems are that she discovered that he was unpossessable. Also, he's the big maestro. He's got the palette. She's the adoring wife, slightly cocking her head in his direction, and her feet barely touching the ground. The body language, I think, suggests his egotism and also his unpossessibility. Rivera was a philanderer. Frida put up with it. She sort of extends herself towards him. She had to play the constant seductress. This is how she described the marriage. She said, "Being the wife of Diego is the most marvelous thing in the world. I let him play matrimony with other women. Diego is not anybody's husband and never will be, but he is a great comrade." For all her insistence that Rivera should be free, Kahlo has placed her and Diego's clasped hands in the very center of her marriage portrait. And it is quite clear that the pivot of her life was the marriage bond. This drawing is in the Harry Ransom collection. I just saw it today, and we decided to add it to my talk because it's interesting. This is the study for the portrait, but here in the study, Kahlo is kind of turning away from Rivera. She's on the opposite side of him. So it's a completely different body language. Also, erased on her stomach is a fetus that actually looked, you can tell, it looked sort of like Diego Rivera. She was dying to have a little, what she called her little Dieguito, but she did not. She was pregnant when she got married. Soon after marriage, she married Rivera. She had a therapeutic abortion at 3 months because the fetus was in the wrong position. And she said, "We could not have a child, and I cried inconsolably, but I distracted myself by cooking, dusting the house, sometimes by painting, and every day going to accompany Diego on the scaffold. It gave him great pleasure when I arrived with the midday meal in a basket covered with flowers." The Riveras were in the United States for most of the first half of the 1930s. That wedding portrait and the drawing were both done in San Francisco. And then they went to Detroit, as we saw in 1932, where she painted Henry Ford Hospital. In Detroit, the pain of miscarriage made Kahlo focus her art on her most personal experience. And it was here that she began to paint mostly self-portraits. And also, it was here that she formed her distinctive style based on retablos, and also on Mexican popular art. And let's see, this is the kind of thing, yeah. This is maybe 3 or 4 inches high. It's a little clay hospital scene. I picked it up in a market in Guadalajara, but there's a sort of a humor. It says the last battle. They had all kinds of hospital scenes, and I thought, that's the kind of thing that Frida Kahlo would have loved. But Frida Kahlo's Henry Ford Hospital is sort of like a retablo with the symbols, those 6 symbols of her miscarriage taking the place of the holy figure. It's a small painting on tin. And I think it has, as like the four inhabitants of Mexico, that sense of incredible loneliness. There she is in her hospital bed, floating in a vast empty plain. And in the far distance is the rouge plant, where the Henry Ford's rouge plant, that Rivera was busy there making studies for his Detroit Institute of Arts murals. So there's a sense that Rivera is far away in the distance, and he loved machines and she hated them. One thing that's interesting about this nude is that Kahlo, when she paints herself nude or dressed, she's never the object of a male gaze, but rather this is the depiction of herself as she felt herself to be. To give you a sense of the scale of Kahlo's paintings, here on the right is a photograph of her painting, the painting that you see on the left, which is called Self-Portrait on the Borderline between the United States and Mexico. She did it in Detroit in 1932. She was really longing to go back to Mexico and really didn't like Detroit very much. But anyway, she made this funny little easel, and and you can see the small size of her paintbrush. Childlessness, the loss of the child in Detroit, began this theme of childlessness that goes through much of her work. This painting is it's called Me and My Doll. It's from 1937. She said about this issue, "Painting completed my life. I lost 3 children. Painting substituted for all of this. I believe work is the best thing." The painting is, there she is smoking again, but it's a very sort of sardonic view of motherhood. It's not a baby, it's a doll, and Kahlo isn't even close to it. She's sitting rigidly with the baby, the baby doll, separate, rather ugly doll too. The childlessness theme, I think, comes out in many of her self-portraits where she's accompanied by her pet monkey. She had lots of monkeys. This one, and this was from the year that she was divorced from Rivera, 1940, this one. And this one is from 1943, Self-Portrait with Monkeys. The monkeys are sort of like substitute children, but they do not really alleviate Kahlo's loneliness. In fact, they sort of almost accentuate it, I think. Another painting on the theme of childlessness is one of her best paintings, I think. It's from 1943. It's called Ruths, where Kahlo has this dream of her body opening up and turning into a vine through which her own blood courses to extend into the parched Mexican earth. And the opening up of her body is often in her paintings is connected with the opening up of these sort of crevices or barrancas, ravines in the Mexican terrain, the desert-like terrain. This is Flower of Life on the left from 44 and Sun and Life on the right from 1942. Childlessness, I think, led to a kind of obsession with the theme of fertility in Frida Kahlo, and it also reinforced her vision of the interconnectedness of all of life, something that she shared with Diego Rivera. There are, both of them painted a lot of hybrids, half human, half plant. In this case, you can see both of these are plants that are also sexual organs. The Riveras were in New York in 1933, where Rivera was painting the Rockefeller Center mural, the one that was chipped off the walls because he put Lenin in it. Anyway, while he was working on his kind of political mural, Kahlo was painting her own small political manifesto called My Dress Hangs There. And what you have is Frida Kahlo's dress with a whole view, her view, a very negative view of Manhattan during the Depression years. She was horrified that watching the rich people sipping cocktails while the poor were standing in bread lines. And the bottom part of the painting actually has bread lines, soldiers. It's a collage, the bottom part of the painting, and there There's some sports scenes and soldiers and bread lines and some violence of the police subjects. Some of those subjects were also in Diego Rivera's mural at Rockefeller Center. Kahlo felt a strong sympathy for the dispossessed, as did Diego Rivera. Basically, in this painting, she's mocking American values, sports, the trophy on the right, on a pedestal, a toilet, Americans' obsession with plumbing, and then there's the telephone there that winds on the top of a building that winds in and out of, its wire winds in and out of all kinds of other buildings. And then on the left, you see Trinity Church, and then in the middle is Federal Hall, and they are connected by a ribbon. Trinity Church, if you look at the window, it's actually turned into a dollar sign. So it seems that she's connecting the church, the Protestant church, with capitalism. The steps of Federal Hall are a collage, which says weekly sales in millions. So she's being very negative. This is the Depression years, and she's upset with the situation in New York of the rich and the poor. She also was really homesick and really wanted to go back to Mexico, so she has absented herself from her dress, and maybe that little boat in the background is where Kahlo wishes to be, on that boat, leaving. But Rivera really wanted to stay in a industrial country where he felt the Marxist revolution was going to take place, so he did not want to leave. But finally, they did leave. He got kicked out of Rockefeller Center, and then they ran out of money. He did not want to leave, but he did, and he sort of blamed Kahlo for it. They returned to Mexico, and he proceeded to have a love affair with Frida Kahlo's younger sister, Cristina, the one you saw a painting of earlier. And Kahlo usually scoffed at Rivera's love affairs, but this one really was too much for her. She painted nothing that we know of in 1934, that year that she found out that he was sleeping with her sister. And then in 1935, there are only two paintings. One of them is a fairly conventional self-portrait where she's cut off her hair and she's wearing regular Western clothes, not Tehuana costumes. And then the other one is this one called A Few Small Nips, 1935. It's not really a self-portrait, but it's kind of a self-portrait. What happened was she read a newspaper article about a woman who was murdered by her boyfriend, and when he was taken before the judge, he said, well, I only gave her a few small nips. Kahlo had a very sardonic sense of humor, so she would have found this funny, but not entirely funny. It's the painting. Her paintings get bloodiest when she's feeling forsaken by Diego Rivera. She said about this painting that she needed to paint it because she felt murdered, quote, murdered by life. And it's interesting, I didn't realize this until we were looking at the painting under bright lights before the Walker Art Gallery show. And she tried to murder the painting. She actually took a knife and stabbed there's apparently a photograph of her doing it. I've never seen the photograph, but there are stab marks all over the frame, and you can see that there's also blood all over the frame. So that it was such a powerful image that it had to kind of extend out. Kahlo is really painted, even though this is prompted by her anger and sorrow, she's kind of like a broadside, and I think her influence here is Jose Guadalupe Posada, the great Mexican printmaker, who painted many images of men's violence towards women. So her painting, being the subject is something that she read in the newspaper, is very much like a painted broadside. She was unable in 1935 to paint herself, having this terrible experience of being betrayed by Rivera. But in 1937, she painted Memory, which on the left, which is a memory of her sorrow over Rivera's love affair with Cristina. Kahlo almost always paints psychic pain through bodily wounds. Her face never changes, even though she's crying here. I've just put in a photograph on the right by Manuel Alvarez Bravo, Kahlo here and in my dress hangs there, the clothes are separate from her, and yet there's this very charged relationship between Frida Kahlo and her clothes that I think the photographer Bravo caught. The bloodiness of many of her paintings, the source for that is the kinds of sculptures or paintings that you see in Mexican churches. These happen not to be Mexican, but they could easily be Mexican. The one on the left is from the 17th century, and the one on the right is from the 18th century. These martyrdoms that you see in Mexican churches, the bloodiness is something that I think had a deep influence on Frida Kahlo. In 1937, Diego Rivera managed to get asylum for Leon Trotsky, the great revolutionary, for him to come to Mexico, and Frida Kahlo lent him her house in Coyoacan, and she and Diego Rivera were living at that point in some houses that they'd had built in San Angel, nearby. Kahlo had a brief love affair with Trotsky, and after she broke up with him, she gave him this self-portrait, which is one of her sort of bombshell self-portraits. It's interesting that she gave such a sort of Creole maiden, aristocratic maiden portrait to the revolutionary. It shows how much she loved the work of 19th century folk portraitists, people like Jose Maria Estrada, whose portrait of a woman in a red dress you see on the right. Rivera also was very much influenced by Estrada. So that's another great source for Kahlo and for Rivera. In 1938, André Breton, the Pope of Surrealism, came to Mexico and claimed Frida Kahlo for Surrealism. And in that year that Rivera was in Mexico, they saw a lot of him. Kahlo painted the one painting that's the closest to surrealism. It's called What the Water Gave Me, 1938. But it's really a bathtub reverie about the past and about death. And in the end, I don't really think Kahlo is at all a surrealist. Her fantasy is very much based on Mexican popular art, and she's not involved with the idea of mystification or enigma. She's really a pretty straightforward painter, and her paintings are always based very closely on her life. She herself didn't think she was a surrealist. She said, quote, "I never knew I was a surrealist until André Breton came to Mexico and told me I was. I never painted dreams. I painted my own reality." But it's certainly true that surrealism and her connection with Breton helped her to follow her own fantasy, and also it helped her with her career. Breton encouraged the New York galleryist Julian Levy, who had a surrealist-oriented gallery on 57th Street, to give Frida Kahlo a show in 1938. She had a show in New York City. And then that group of paintings traveled to Paris and in a show that Breton organized that was actually called Mexique. It was a lot of Mexican things, and amongst which was this group of Frida Kahlo's paintings. That was fall of 1939, so it was very, the war was imminent, and it was didn't get a huge sensation, that show, but Frida was pleased with it. She wrote to Nick Murai, who had been her lover and was a dear friend. She wrote to him about the show. She said, "There were a lot of people on the day of the opening. Great congratulations for the Chicua," that's her nickname. "Among them, a big hug from Juan Miró, and great praises for my painting from Kandinsky, and congratulations from Picasso and Tanguy, and from Breton, and from other big kakas of surrealism." She had a certain success in that this little painting it's actually done on glass, called The Frame, was sold to the Louvre. It's now in the Pompidou Center. And Rivera was very proud that she had a painting in the Louvre. When she got back to Mexico, their marriage fell apart. Rivera asked her for a divorce. No one knows precisely why. He was, at this point, involved with Paulette Goddard, the actress. But it could be that he found out about Trotsky. Nobody really knows precisely why they divorced. Kahlo was desperate about it. She wrote to Nick Murai in English. She wrote to him in English. She wrote, "2 weeks ago, we began the divorce. I have no word to tell you how much I've been suffering, and knowing how much I love Diego, you must understand that this troubles will never end in my life. Now I feel so rotten and lonely that it seems to me that nobody in the world has suffered the way I do. But of course it will be different in a few months." The painting here is the two Fridas. During the divorce, Kahlo was very depressed and also became very ill. But somehow she managed to paint many of her most powerful self-portraits in this year, partly because she needed to make money and didn't want to take money from Rivera. It seems also that misery energized her creative process. About the two Fridas from 1939, she said that the Tehuana one on the right, the one in the Tehuana costume, was the one that Diego Rivera had loved, and the one on the left in the Victorian dress is the one that he no longer loved. The Tehuana Frida holds a little oval miniature portrait of Rivera from the red frame. From that frame springs a vein that goes through both of the Frida Kahlo's extracted hearts, which is a pretty straightforward symbol of pain and love for Frida. And the Frida in the white wedding type dress tries to close off that flow of blood that originates from Rivera, but doesn't succeed. It keeps on dripping. And in a kind of sly, almost Garcia Marquez-like image, some of the blood splotches, some of the flowers embroidered on her skirt have been transformed into blood splotches. Kahlo wrote in October 1939 about this painting. She wrote to the critic Alfonso Manrique saying, "The fact that I painted myself twice, I think, is nothing but the representation of my loneliness. What I mean to say is, I resorted to myself. I sought my own help. This is the reason why the two figures are holding hands. There is little more I am able to explain because all the truly lively motives for this painting are, without doubt, subconscious. I believe the clear object of this painting is the relation between my inner life and Diego." The two Fridas is certainly one of the loneliest paintings ever painted, and in her self-enclosed world, Kahlo holds her own hand. Back to this wonderful portrait that I hope you've all seen tonight, Self-Portrait with Thorns from 1940. Here, Frida Kahlo she was brought up as a Catholic, although she left Catholicism as a teenager, but there's a lot of Catholicism in her work, and here she has clearly identified her own sufferings with those of Christ. The thorns, Christ's crown of thorns, is puncturing her skin, but she never lets go in any of her paintings of her fierce impassivity. It's probable that painting such stoic images gave her a kind of strength. It was a way of sort of fortifying herself. The hummingbird is supposed to be a love charm, but it's clearly a dead hummingbird, so it hasn't worked in this case during Frida's divorce. That Camito de Guayabal was the name of a little monkey on the left. He is fingering the crown of thorns, and even though he looks quite sweet, one little tug at that thing will make Frida bleed even more. And then you have the cat that's going to probably pounce even on the dead bird. So it's a pretty tense situation here. But there's some hope, I think, because the butterflies that she has in her headdress were a symbol of transcendence. And then above them, and also are butterflies that are transformed into flowers, or maybe it's the other way around, flowers transformed into butterflies, sort of taking off into the sky. So maybe they are the idea that one has to get up and beyond such miseries. One last divorce painting is Self-Portrait with Cropped Hair from 1940. Kahlo, both when he had the affair with Christina and when he divorced her in 1939, she stopped wearing her Tehuano costume that Rivera loved so much, and she cut off her long hair that he also loved. Here she's probably wearing Diego Rivera's suit. And she's done is taken, it's a very angry painting, but she's taken a painting of her own situation of loneliness and turned it into a popular song illustration. Jose Guadalupe Posada did a lot of song illustrations. And this song says up above what the song says. It says, "You see, if I loved you, it was for your hair. Now that you are bald, I don't love you anymore." So there's a certain humor, but there's also a definite misery here. Rivera was very concerned about Frida Kahlo's health, so he asked her to come. He was in San Francisco busy painting a mural on Treasure Island for the Golden Gate International Fair, and he'd gone off with Paulette Goddard actually to California. And he asked Frida to come because he was worried about her health. He wanted her to consult doctors in San Francisco. And when she came, he put her into, this is the detail of his Treasure Island mural, and there she is in the middle wearing her Tehuana dress, and this time she's holding a palette, and just to the right of her, you can see Diego Rivera holding hands with Paulette Goddard around the tree of love and life. And he was good with journalists. He told a journalist that Frida, he always painted her as a symbol of something, never as an individual. He said, Frida represents, quote, the Mexican artist with a sophisticated European background who has turned to native plastic tradition for inspiration. She personifies the cultural union of the Americas for the South. And Paulette Goddard, holding hands with him around the tree of love and life, she said that she stands for, quote, American girlhood shown in friendly contact with a Mexican man. And then he's asked why he was holding hands with Goddard. And he was incorrigible. He said, it means closer Pan-Americanism. By this time, Rivera had rejected Trotsky, possibly because he found out about Frida's affair, but also he was a pretty erratic political character. And he was all for Pan-American unity to fight fascism. So they remarried on his birthday, December 8th, 1940. And Kahlo's first self-portrait from after the remarriage is this one. It's as though she's taken all that hair that she chopped off in my self-portrait with cropped hair, made it into a kind of braid and stuck it on top of her head as a reaffirmation of femininity. But it isn't a very happy self-portrait. I think all the same problems existed in their second marriage. Even she had married him again with the condition that she would be financially independent. I don't know whether she ended up being financially independent. Also that they would not have sexual relations. Again, we don't know what actually happened there, whether they did or they didn't, but that was her stipulation because she just got too jealous of thinking about all the other women. Anyway, all the same problems continued in their marriage. And you can sort of feel the threateningness of this wonderful plant with the serrated leaves, and that also her necklace almost seems like it's going to choke her. This one is from 1943, Self-Portrait as a Tehuana. Here you feel that Diego Rivera is in her forehead. He was the kind of obsessive thought that she could never really get out of her head, but she seems almost like a big spider that's trapping the thought of him within her forehead. Even though she didn't want to be possessive, she definitely was. And I think that shows also in this little painting on the left from 1944. It's a tiny little painting about the size of your hand that she gave to him as an anniversary present in 1944. It shows that the desire to possess him, here she's actually merged with Diego. The head is half Frida, half Diego. It's kind of symbiotic union. However, it's a very disjunctive union because the two faces don't actually line up, so there's a lot of tension here. And then to hold them together, there's this kind of almost like another crown of thorns necklace that's kind of choke them. So the marriage bond, in this case, almost becomes a martyrdom. On the right, is a tiny little Tlatilco head, just showing the idea. She loved pre-Columbian art and was often influenced by it. And the whole idea of duality, of male, female, or two heads in one, is something that she got from pre-Columbian art. That was a pin. That Tlatilco head, pre-Columbian head, is only about an inch tall, maybe an inch and a half, and she turned it into a brooch that she actually ended up giving to a lover much later in her life. This is another anniversary present, this one from 1947, a drawing. It's called Ruin, and again, I think the head is sort of half Frida, half Diego, and she's written up on the left, Deceit Avenue, and then over here on the right, she wrote Deceit Avenue, then she wrote Ruin, house for birds, nest for love, all for nothing, ruin, February 1947. Relationship, as you can see, is not an easy one. He tried to divorce her again in 1949. He was mad for Maria Felix, the beautiful movie star. You see him with Maria Felix in this newspaper photograph, and then behind Diego and Maria Felix is his portrait of Maria Felix that he wanted to make the centerpiece of a big show in Bellas Artes, but Maria ended up not lending it to him. And then in the end, she didn't want to marry him. But Kahlo, Maria Felix was also an intimate friend of Frida Kahlo, so it was a double betrayal. And this was, again, a situation like, as with Christina, the Christina affair, Frida Kahlo couldn't sort of laugh it off. This self-portrait on the right was done during this distraught and miserable period, and it's one of the few self-portraits in which Kahlo almost loses that mask of control. She did actually try to kill herself during this period. Then Rivera came back to her. Maria didn't want him, and there was some sort of resolution in their marriage, which I think you can see in this painting from 1949 also. It's got a long title, The Love Embrace of the Universe, the Earth, Mexico, Diego, me, and Senor Xolotl. Xolotl is a little escuincle dog. They had a lot of those hairless Mexican dogs. That's one of them, asleep on the universe's brown arm. It seems that in order to stay together, they have to have this series of love embraces of the universe and the earth, holding them together. But Kahlo here has discovered that the way to hold on to Diego Rivera is to treat him as though he was a baby. She becomes the nurturing mother. She wrote, women, among them I, would always want to hold him in their arms like a newborn baby. At every moment, he is my child born every moment, diary from myself. This was in her diary. For all the sort of resolution of the marriage and her pleasure in having him back, she's still bleeding. Her chest is cracked open, and so is Mexico, or the earth behind her. That chest is cracked open. So after 1949, Rivera really couldn't leave Frida. Her health deteriorated starting in the middle of the 40s. And then she had something like 30 surgical operations, and she painted her reaction to surgery. This first one of that subject is The Broken Column from 1944. She had to wear all kinds of different orthopedic corsets, and this is one of them. And she said it was really like a Calvary. Here, her body is opened up, and she's replaced her own broken spinal column with a broken ionic column. And her open body is like the fissures in the earth behind her. She always connects her own opened body with the desert-like Mexican earth. Nails are driven into her flesh. She's presenting herself as a kind of female Saint Sebastian, an idol for both herself and for others to worship. She's taking, as she often did, the role of the heroic sufferer. And tears are dotting her cheeks, but for all her implacable strength, she has this incredible reserve and strength, but she never acts. She is always, in almost all of her paintings, she's not active. She is acted upon. Kahlo is the immobilized victim of things done to her body. Yet, although she is the victim, there is something really stalwart in her gaze, some kind of weird strength in her gaze. In her self-portrait, she is never the passive model for the male onlooker, and even though she's immobilized, instead, she is the object of her own piercing and highly active regard. And thus, the paintings, for all their stasis, shake with life because they embody explosive feeling held in check by steely will. Another surgery subject, she had a spinal fusion at the Hospital for Special Surgery in 1946. This was a gift for the friend that recommended the surgeon, Dr. Wilson. And it actually is like the illustration of a song that she loved called La Venedita, the Little Deer. It's about her sense of vulnerability. It's also interesting that she had a little deer. That's her and her little deer, a photograph taken by Nick Murray. In 1938, that photograph was taken. And one more, another painting to do with surgery. It's called Tree of Hope. It also was, this one she did after the spinal fusion. And she said, quote, "It's nothing but the result of the damned operation." The operation really didn't work very well. It's possible that Frida Kahlo didn't do all the things the doctor said and take care of herself. Anyway, here we have Frida's duality again. Frida in the Tewana dress on the right is the heroic sufferer, and then you have Frida lying on the hospital trolley, the tragic victim. But the heroic Frida, holding a flag that has the words of a song that she loved called Tree of Hope, Keep Firm, is what it says on the flag. It's almost as though Frida is the holy image transacting her own salvation in a retablo or ex voto. So in spite of that spinal fusion, there was the gradual collapse of her spine. In 1950 to 51, she was in the hospital for a year, having some 7 operations on her back. And afterwards, she made this portrait on the left as a gift for her surgeon, Dr. Faril. This is from 1951, this painting. And on the right is a photograph by Giselle Freund of Frida Kahlo and Dr. Faril and Frida painting the painting that you see on the left. You can see in this painting that she's taken her own heart and put it on her palette, and so that the pigment with which she's painting is actually her own blood. So she's saying that she paints from the heart. It's a little bit like a retablo. It's a very small painting, and with Dr. Faril taking the place of the holy image. Kahlo said in her diary, "Dr. Faril saved me. He gave me back the joy of life." But she also said that she didn't know if she would be able to walk again, and that she felt, quote, "a desperation that no words can describe." She tried to eradicate that desperation by clinging to her alegria, or her joy, her happiness. That was she was most noted for and by her friends, and also by painting. But her will to live was nearly broken in 1953 when her right leg was amputated at the knee. These are 2 drawings from her diary about having to do with the amputation. They're both from 1953. The one on the left says, "Feet, what do I need them for if I have wings to fly?" And the other one is a little more discouraged. On the right, you have a self-portrait of Frida falling apart, and she says, "I am disintegration." This is one of her very last paintings. It's called Marxism Will Give Health to the Sick. It's from 1954. At the end of her life, politics became a kind of religion for her. Rivera was trying to get back into the Communist Party, and Kahlo became kind of obsessed with Stalin and Marx and very vehement about it, probably partly to help Rivera. Anyway, this painting is self-portrait. It's sort of like a retablo. Again, this time, Marx in the sky with his white beard is the miracle-making saint that enables Frida Kahlo to cast aside her crutches. If you look at this painting, it has none of the beautiful delicacy of her earlier brushstrokes. The miniaturist style is completely abandoned, partly because at this point she was taking a lot of drugs. Started with she became addicted to drugs, that starting with a medical addiction, Demerol and all kinds of other things. So her handling in the late works becomes very crude. She was only able to paint for very short periods, tied to her wheelchair. So she wanted at this period to make her art political, but it remained, I think, quite self-referential. Her last drawing in her diary is the ones that you see here, a kind of black angel of death on the right. Her last words were, "I hope the exit is joyful, and I hope never to come back." And she did. She died in July 1954, almost certainly a suicide from an overdose of drugs. People think it was a suicide is because she gave her anniversary gift to Rivera weeks before their actual anniversary. After she died, Rivera gave her Coyoacan house. You see Kahlo here in a photograph by Florence Arquin in the patio again of the house. He gave the house to the people of Mexico in memory of his wife. And it's now, as I said, the Frida Kahlo Museum. After she died, he said, "Too late now, I realized that the most wonderful part of my life had been my love for Frida." Wish it'd be better if he'd shown it a little bit before. He did love her, and she was very important to him, but he was certainly made her life difficult. In the Frida Kahlo Museum is this is the last image, this painting from 1954. Actually, she began it in 1952, but finished it 8 days before she died. She wrote, "Viva la vida, long live life," on that front slice of watermelon. And the painting, I think, is a salute to the joy of life, but it's also, I think, an acknowledgement of the imminence of death. In her last terrible months, Frida Kahlo wrote in her journal, quote, "I have achieved a lot. I will be able to walk. I will be able to paint. I love Diego more than I love myself. My will is great. My will remains." And I think she was certainly right. Her will does remain. And to this day, thanks to the story that she told in paint, Kahlo's example of strength in adversity is there to fortify us all. Thank you very much. And I will take questions.
I believe, out in the audience there somewhere. Possibly not. We have just enough time for 2 or 3 questions, and I'll let Hayden answer those first come, first serve with their questions. Are there any questions? Down here.
Hi, can you tell me how your book became a movie? What the process of that was?
Oh, such a long process. It was picked up in the very beginning by a wonderful independent producer called Nancy Harden, and who just loved the subject of Frida Kahlo and became kind of totally impassioned by it. And then it went from one place to the next. It went from New Line to HBO, and finally ended up with Miramax, partly because Selma Hayek was so passionate about Frida Kahlo. So she had a lot to do with persuading the Weinsteins to do a Frida Kahlo film. But the process, I didn't have that much to do with it. I spent 2 days with Julie Taymor going over the script, which was 2 of the best days of my life, really intense. And I had read the script and made notes, and a lot of it was terrible. And I'd made notes, and so luckily Julie and I both agreed on all the things that were terrible, but then when I'd make a suggestion, well, Frida should say this, Julie would say, "Hayden, you don't know anything about movies. This is how it should go." And then she would talk for about 3 paragraphs, and it was brilliant. And then she'd say, "Okay, what did I say?" Somebody should have had a tape recorder, because the woman is a genius, and it was incredible working with her. She did not, things that when we finally saw the beginning sort of cuts of the movie, there were certain things that I wasn't crazy about, like the image of the thing in the market that Rivera takes breasts and she takes a fruit and pretends it's a male sexual organ. She just wouldn't have done that in the 30s in Mexico. You didn't act like that in markets. They had too much respect for people in the markets. And I also didn't like the puppets much, but you don't tell a genius like Julie Taymor whether, I mean, she doesn't listen very much.
The producer that came to you originally, had she read the book and took an interest?
Yes, yeah, she had.
Just contacted you?
Yeah.
You weren't looking for a movie?
No, I wasn't. She went, I guess she contacted my agent, actually. She called him, and then he said, there's this person. And he knew, she'd also been in publishing, so she knew New York publishing world quite well. And he said she's the only producer that actually reads. so she was good. She was great. Any other questions? You?
How did you become interested in studying
Frida Kahlo. I was a graduate student at the City University of New York and in 20th century American art. And my mother lived in Mexico, and my mother's a painter. And one of my favorite teachers in graduate school was with his wife. It's Max and Joyce Kozloff. He was a critic and also an editor at Art Forum, and we were all in Mexico at the same time, and they met me at the door with a Frida Kahlo catalog from a show that was in Mexico City. And he said, why don't you write about this for Art Forum and you can also make it a school, independent studies school paper towards your PhD. And I sort of looked at this catalog and thought, this is so bizarre. I'd never seen anything like that before, her works. I went to the show that was then in Mexico City and was just overwhelmed by her paintings. I was so surprised that I'd never heard of her. And so I wrote the paper, and it was published in Art Forum in 1976. And then a wonderful editor at Harper and Row, who was the poetry editor, Sylvia Plath's editor, actually. She also did Mexican cookbooks of Diana Kennedy. She was the editor for Sylvia Plath and Mexican cookbooks. And so Frida was right up her alley. So she wrote me a little note saying, would you write a biography, which I thought was really trusting. So then I decided, okay, I'll make it my PhD dissertation. It was my dissertation. And yeah, it was great. I had to shorten it a little bit to make it into a book. Any more questions? There's one over there.
I think I heard you say that her friends saw her as a joyful person.
Yes.
Why was that not reflected in her art, or rarely reflected?
Because of what she needed her art to do, which was to get her to confront her pain and to make it known. She really wanted, and to get people to pay attention to her. No, her paintings are not joyful at all. I'm trying to think if there are any. I mean, maybe the wedding portrait's sort of somewhat jolly. And then some of the still lives are quite, there's one in this collection that's quite joyful. But in general, her self-portraits are all about extracting pain out of herself. But she was fun. I mean, she loved to dance, she loved to go to parties and adored to drink and loved to curse, and she's a lot of fun. Everybody loved her. So, any other? Yes?
Would you briefly discuss Frida's ability to paint so good after she was not really a painting in the beginning? She was going to be a doctor. And would you talk about the fact that she might have been a folk artist, or a painting seemed to be a bit naivete?
There might be what?
Naivete. In other words, she's more like a primitive in a way.
Right. Well, you know, I think it was an intentional, she needed to be primitive because the subjects would have been so gruesome if they weren't toned down or if they were any more realistic. But some of her portraits from the 40s of other people are extremely realistic. I mean, she really could paint in a completely realistic way, but she chose that primitivism, I think, to distance the pain of her subjects. She was self-taught. She had worked a little bit with a printmaker before the accident, and then her father made these awful kitschy little paintings of sort of milkmaids with cows and chickens and things like that. So there was, I mean, technically he was fine. I don't know whether he probably encouraged her. Her mother was the one that gave her the paints and an easel. But she's pretty much self-taught. Any more questions? Yes?
How much longer did Diego Rivera live?
Until
He married him?
he did. He married his dealer. He lived 3 more years. Interesting that one of his last paintings is of watermelons too, of sort of sliced open watermelons. He lived 3 more years. He married Emma Hurtado, and he actually got cancer of the penis and went to Russia.